In the world of comic books, there are a few questions that hang around us at all times. Will Tom King not win an Eisner this year? Will people stop comparing comic books to manga, for God's sakes? The answer to both of those is no. But one question hangs above all others. Hey, what's the deal with Grant Morrison? Grant Morrison is an author primarily characterized by their encyclopedic knowledge of the DC universe, to the point that I think the original version of the DC encyclopedia was probably bound in their skin like a nerdy Necronomicon. Which makes sense, because Morrison believes that they are a literal sorcerer who can perform magic.
I don't know, is there any practicing magicians in the audience? Put your hand up if we got any.
Particularly sigil magic. You see, after an experience in the early 90s, one that Morrison can only describe as alien abduction, Morrison began practicing sigil magic, the practice of imbuing images and symbology with power in an effort to change one's life for the better.
The only reason I was abducted by aliens in Kathmandu in 1994 is because I went to Kathmandu in 1994 to be abducted by aliens.
This led their written works to take on a different vibe, let's say, from everyone else. For instance, Morrison is known for having their own ideas about what continuity means in a long-running multi-author story like, let's say, Batman, for example. Things that were declared non-canon decades ago are simply brought back into the fold as if nothing happened, even stories that directly contradict other stories. To Grant Morrison, everything that was published under mainline DC continuity is still canon, because every single issue possesses a degree of mystical power. So for characters like Batman, in the eyes of Grant Morrison, they're not just printed characters, they're gods. These concepts work in their Batman run. It's a massive epic that has the time to breathe and discuss these concepts. What doesn't work is when you try to cram this level of story into a single event comic. Case in point, Final Crisis. Final Crisis should have been a slam dunk for DC. Think about it, you have one of the biggest authors at the time working on the finale to a massive trilogy of comics that has been running since the 1980s. The problem is that Final Crisis is so loaded with ideas and literary concepts in every single panel to the point that it is impossible to follow. Villains who haven't been seen for decades return, entirely new characters are introduced as if we're supposed to know who they are, and it's all written in this bizarre poetic ramble of exposition where no one sounds like a character and instead sounds like they're just screaming catchphrases at each other. There's a clone army of Batmen, a vampire from the end of existence, and an infinitely powerful robot fueled by the idea of Superman, and yes, one day I will explain what this all means, but for this video, just know that this kind of broke people on Morrison. Or at least it was one of the two things around that time that did. You see, during their run on Batman, Morrison also introduced a character known as Damian Wayne, who was rapidly met with hatred from fans at the time who saw Bruce having a secret biological son as a true shark-jumping moment. It didn't help that Damian was characterized as a brash, arrogant, haughty, and rude brat who didn't abide by his father's rules when it came to fighting crime. Later issues of this run would lead to fans begrudgingly liking him, and today Damian is a beloved member of the larger Batman cast. He's a kind-hearted animal lover with an artistic side. His mother didn't fare as well, sadly. It's important to remember going forward that this book was being written in the mid-2000s, a time that was primarily characterized by how much Western folks really hated the Middle East, and Morrison was not exempt from being caught up in this wave of Islamophobia. And thus, they rewrote Talia's character to fit the popular views of this time. Talia al Ghul went from being an extremely interesting character, someone who was Bruce's intellectual, philosophical, and physical equal, but who could never truly be with him due to their differing beliefs and the looming shadow of her father, someone who was truly the perfect counterpoint to Bruce Wayne, the world's greatest detective and the woman who was trained to be undetectable, someone who Bruce loved not just because she was beautiful, but because she was the only person on Earth that he felt was a true peer to him, to a mustache-twirling villain who hypnotizes an army of children and clones her own son just so she can throw him into an early grave. Also, brief sidebar, there's this popular belief that Morrison retconned Damian's conception to be assault on the part of Talia, and it mostly comes from this one panel where Bruce claims he wasn't in his right mind when Damian was conceived, and I need to nip this in the bud right now. Yes, Morrison wrote Talia to be an explicitly evil character, but throughout Morrison's time writing Bruce Wayne, they've held the belief that Bruce is incapable of physical romantic intimacy and finds the concept repulsive in a germophobic way unless it is with someone he trusts completely. This goes back to the very late 80s where Morrison wrote Clayface as a representation of Bruce's fear of physical intimacy, a single touch that could lead to illness. This is a good moment, a moment that feels important for the time it was written, no doubt directly meant to invoke the AIDS crisis of the time, and it's no coincidence that this moment was written by a queer, non-binary author like Morrison who has no doubt also dealt with this fear. AIDS was still a terrifying concept that was ravaging the gay community at the time, to the point where some people viewed it as a literal biblical plague. And so, when I read Bruce refuting that he was ever willingly intimate with Talia, I don't see Morrison writing Talia to be a sexual predator. I see Morrison remembering their own continuity and sticking to it. Bruce had finally put his shield down around Talia, and now that she has revealed herself to be a villain, he regrets this action and denies that it ever happens. It's a petty thing to do, and it characterizes Bruce Wayne as a massive jerk, but it doesn't make Talia the monster some people misinterpret this panel portraying her as. That being said, it's still an awful rewrite of a character that we're all still recovering from as both authors and fans. But Batman is not the only character that Morrison has written for. In fact, you'll be hard-pressed to find a DC character they haven't at least mentioned in one of their books. They've also written for Marvel, they've penned several novels, and a non-fiction book about what superheroics and comic books mean to them personally. I would argue Morrison is one of the most important comic creators of the last 50 years. For better or worse. And the main reason for that, in my opinion, is that Morrison is never ashamed to be a comic book creator. So many authors see comics as somewhere to start, to cut their teeth before moving to the big leagues, or they want their comics to be as cinematic and adaptable as possible for later adaptations. Morrison, on the other hand, dives into comics like a bizarre, metatextual Scrooge McDuck. Take their opinions on what makes a good Superman story.
American writers often say it's difficult to write Superman. They say he's too powerful, you can't give him problems. But Superman is a metaphor. For me, Superman has the same problems we do, but on a Paul Bunyan scale.
You see, Morrison views Superman as the antithetical statement of an impossible everyman, a Norman Rockwell painting cloaked in the skin of a Greco-Roman deity, the inverse to his Batman, who is a man that forged himself into an unstoppable force of nature. Morrison's Clark Kent is a lightning bolt that works at a cubicle. There's a reason that All-Star Superman is regarded by many people as the definitive Superman book, and why it's one of the main inspirations for the upcoming Superman film directed by James Gunn. It cements Clark as a deeply vulnerable man who spends every second of his existence helping people on such a vast scale that things like supervillains or world borders are secondary to his primary intent of kindness. Not that these ideas didn't exist in Superman stories before, but going back to Morrison's advanced knowledge of DC, they can tie a large bow on these concepts in a palatable and concise way that's both tragic and a hell of a lot of fun. This also beautifully contrasts in how Morrison characterizes Lex Luthor, a supremely insecure and petty man who will stop at nothing to be liked more than a literal smiling ball of sunshine. Someone who could have used their infinite wealth and intelligence to save lives the world over, but instead wastes those funds and brain cells on vapid and petty schemes that help no one and only wind up embarrassing himself. But for me, neither of these books, Batman or All-Star Superman, represent what makes Morrison an intriguingly complicated author in the same way that one comic does above all others, Animal Man. Someone else creates you to be perfect and innocent, and then I step in and spoil everything. It's a little bit satanic, I suppose. I can make you say and do anything. I can make you hate your wife and children. I can make you forget you were ever married. As we've discussed previously, every Grant Morrison comic is about comics and their assumed magical power. But Animal Man is where it was all cranked up to 11. Everything from a perpetually immortal coyote that represents the iconic Looney Tunes character who rebels against the god that created him and cursed him to suffer, all the way to the hero, Buddy Baker, coming face to face with Grant Morrison himself, who openly admits to having destroyed Buddy's life for the sake of edgy realism and cheap sales. The writer, as they are known, even laments the recent passing of their cat and how awful they felt using that sad moment in their life as fuel to write a silly comic book about a dude with animal powers. It exists as both a man versus God parallel, but also a man versus author tale of corporate interference. It posits that every fictional character that has ever existed is just a vessel or tulpa for authors and artists to throw their own problems on until they break under the immense weight of a real human being's issues. Another sidebar, I'm sorry. This writer's self-insert for Morrison would later join Task Force X and get mauled by a werewolf. James Gunn, if you ever make another Squad movie, please adapt this. I want to see Grant Morrison in white face paint fighting werewolves. In the eyes of Grant Morrison, particularly in Animal Man, we are all vessels for super gods that are at our own mercy, who can do what we want when we want them to. These gods of superstring dimensions who can fit neatly into our pockets. We are the author, and yet we inspire ourselves with our own creation. Your world must be terrible. It seems so gray and bleak. How can you possibly live in a world without superheroes? We get by. Thank you all for watching, and if you want to see more of this, please subscribe. I also have a TikTok where there's a massive backlog of shorter videos where I talk about everything from Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark to how terrible modern reprint colorization is. Also, please consider donating to my new Patreon. It'll really help me out. It'll help me get better editing software, it'll help me get better microphones, and it'll help me make more videos like this. Thank you.